today we're here for grief around this season, which is like the end of los Muertos. So with that, I would love to introduce the panel. Okay, well, without further ado, I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. So my question for you is to first your name, and then out of the 5 sentences, what is something that you would like to share with the group on something that helps you process grief or reminds you of grief?
Hi all, my name is Dario. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a bilingual psychotherapist at Latinx Talk Therapy. One of the senses that come to mind when I had this question asked to me a little bit earlier, I had preparation, was touch. An experience that I had with loss recently, maybe a few years ago, was with my pet. His name is Mochi, little puffball. The last moments that we had with him were this at-home euthanasia that we conducted together. And just like content warning, sorry for any details, but I'll say it that we had gathered together. It was kind of just like a ritual kind of setting. And the very last thing before we saw like Mochi pass away was just a puff of fur kind of fall off of his paw. And we kind of like felt that. It was the softness, the warmth, and just like the texture is what my body associates and creates memories out of when it comes to processing grief. Thanks, y'all.
Hola, my name is Marilyn Rodriguez. I am a bilingual psychotherapist and also a community liaison at Latinx Talk Therapy. And Latinx Talk Therapy is a mental health clinic. We do individual services, mental health therapy services for couples, individuals, children, families. We also conduct immigration evaluations, and part of like the community engagement that we do is normalizing conversations surrounding mental health. And so we're all really excited to be here. For me, something that helps me process grief would be sound. When I think about the biggest loss in my life, it's my abuelito who passed away 4 years ago, and he loved music. And anytime that I just listen to music, I go back to those memories where I was listening to music with him. And like, he would wake up at 5 a.m. and he would turn on the radio and he would play music for my birthday and my siblings and my primas, our birthdays. He would always wake us up at 5 a.m. playing Las Mañanitas. And at the time, we'd get really upset about it because it was so early and we were just trying to sleep. But now thinking back to it, like, you know, I long for that, just hearing his voice and the music that he would play.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Rodriguez. I am also a bilingual psychotherapist at Latinx Talk Therapy. Something that would connect me to grief in terms of senses would probably be smell. When thinking of grief and how it's impacted my life, I can think of just certain scents that would remind me of a past season of life, and it just brings a lot of familiarity. I think that could be whether it's like a perfume or the sense of like the smell of a soap that like someone used to use, and can remind me so much of what that time was like for me and bring a lot of memories that I didn't even remember I had. So I think there's something really cool about that.
So my abuelita, she passed away in 2022, and we all kind of saw it coming. And I happened to be already in Mexico, so I took a bus from Mexico City. And I had this coloring book. So when I found out that she was already like on her last days, I started coloring in this coloring book, and I still have it to this day. And the other day I started coloring in it again. And what I really like about it is that it's like pieces of Mexico. So there's one with tamales, there's one for an ofrenda. And during the novenario, I felt like a little kid, but I would start coloring while we were praying too, before and after. And that was just something for me. So I don't know if that's, what sense would that be? Touch?
Can you combine stuff?
I was thinking about how we can kind of introduce and get to know all of you a little bit more. So I thought that was like a unique way to bring it up. I do want to bring up also that if anyone at any point needs to step away, it is nice-ish in Chicago. So if you want to step outside, just have a moment. And then also in the back, if you just want to squeeze your way over. Once again, I apologize for the packed house. I did not know everyone was going to come. We had some people actually come in, and then they're like, oh, I didn't buy a ticket. I'm like, how do I turn away people that want to talk about their mental health? So apologies in advance because I didn't turn them away and I let them all in. So with that, let's see if we can introduce our first topic, which is Dia de los Muertos and how that ties into the process of grieving. Are there examples that each of you can give of maybe like your first memory of maybe an ofrenda or Dia de los Muertos that you want to share? It could be the first, it could be a recent, or something that's really pivotal for you on how you process grief with the holiday around this time?
Dia de los Muertos has always been really special in my household. Ever since I was young, I remember helping my abuelita and my tia and my grandpa, put up the ofrenda. And like, it was always really special because it would even get to like choosing pictures. And like, I remember I don't really remember, but when I was young, like I didn't even know whose pictures were going on there. I just knew that it was something that we had to do. But now, that I have more close losses, right, where I get to participate in the ofrenda and I get to put now my own ofrenda in mi casa, it's so special. But even to this day, like sometimes I go over to my abuelita's house and my tia and they bake pan with people's initials and it's so beautiful. I think that for me, I didn't get more connected to that part of the cultura in Mexico until the passing of my grandpa, when I spent, Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, and I just saw the beautiful celebration that, we do to honor our loved ones.
Thanks for sharing. Something that kind of is conjured up in my brain when I think about this question is, well, one, I was a snot-nosed brat when I was younger. I didn't really realize that when we were altar making at the home that it had a meaning or anything, or that there was a narrative attached to it. The way that my family would decorate it, the very first memory that I have is kind of seeing my mom add pictures of like my great-grandparents and everything. And I, for a moment, kind of thought, is this like a second like Halloween? Like what's going on? It was much to my ignorance. And it wasn't until later in the night, my mom was kind of there by herself and I heard like weeping and everything, and she got to tell me a story about, my great-grandparents kind of like being in Mexico, and we didn't have the closest relationship. I didn't grow up with my great-grandparents, but I got to like understand like how they had their own rituals, how they would wake up early in the morning and like clean the house and everything on my mom's side. And even today I kind of like realized that the things that we get to adorn the altar with, like favorite snacks, favorite moments, favorite textural experiences, that's kind of what comes to mind too. So I have a much more fused attachment to the altar making process of how it tells a story, and how we can like associate different kinds of memories to that, remembering. Yeah.
I was just talking to the group about this before, but yeah, when thinking about my own experience with Dia de los Muertos and my parents, so both my parents had lost both of their parents really young, like before they even had children. So none of my siblings and I ever got to meet our grandparents. And so I think for us, we just never talked about death. So we didn't even like celebrate Dia de los Muertos or take time and space for our grief. It was just something that I started learning more about once I got into high school and was in classes that would teach me the background and history of this holiday. But yeah, I would say like more disconnected for me. And I think it's something that I'm learning more as like an adult, how to reconnect with that and what that means also, how I see like my work as a therapist and how meaningful I think a holiday like this can be for our community. And so I think mine is still a journey that I'm learning about.
No, for sure. And I appreciate that each of us have like a unique experience with it. And it's okay, like if it's just journey too. That's what I really appreciate about Latinx Talk Therapy, because last year when we did this, it was myself and then a community member, Adrienne. And each conversation always has a unique piece because everyone brings a different element, a different storyline to something. We could all be talking about like grief, for example, and then everyone has their own pathway with that. So I appreciate you sharing, all three of you actually. Now a question. Oh, actually, I'll answer the question. I'm getting not forget about myself. Mm-hmm. For me, I grew up always with the concept of an ofrenda or some kind of ode to a past loved one year round. So growing up, I had a little sister that passed away, and we still kept her like little crib. And she actually had her own little room in her new house. She'd like never lived in that home, but my mom made an effort to always keep her things. Like she was very like, don't touch anything, don't move anything. Everything that she could, my mom kept in this room. And then once we moved into another home, my mom always had an ofrenda like year round, like always. So I never connected it with Dia de los Muertos because it was like an everyday thing in my household. It wasn't until I think I was in third grade or 4th grade that a teacher was like, hey, like everyone, we're going to be like learning about Day of the Dead. And he was one of the only Hispanic teachers that I had growing up. And it was for history class. And then we watched this documentary and it was based in Oaxaca. And I was like, first of all, what's Oaxaca? Like, I grew up in Michoacan. Like, I don't know what this is. And I remember like vividly trying to understand, even like the word Oaxaca, I'm like, that's an interesting word. But as I was watching this, I was like, wait, like to have a part of my history class, even though it was only one day, be a part of something, a part of like my cultural identity that I didn't even learn about it. My parents never really like sat me down and be like, okay, this is what today means. I thought that was really special that teacher really went out of his way to bring Pan Muerto and really teach us, which was a majority of Hispanics, Mexicans specifically, to teach us about our own culture. So that's how it kind of stood out for me. Now, I kind of want to do a check with everyone who has like Mexican descent. Raise a hand. Okay. I can just say everyone, if not everyone. Now, also, if this is your first event, would love a raise of hands, just kind of get like a pulse check. First event with us. Okay, we got a couple. Okay, round of applause for y'all. Put a note in. Okay, repeated individuals that have come to our events before, would love to also give you a shout out. Okay, Lazy. Haven't had them in guys. I usually do it at the beginning, but I definitely forgot. So I just wanted to do a little pulse check. Well, once again, I just want you all to thank yourselves for coming, because you could have spent your Tuesday evening doing anything else, but you wanted to be proactive and talk about something as complex as grief. So I just wanted to do a little pause there. Now, this is kind of a heavy question, and if one of you wants to answer, let's say someone comes to you and they're like, I am going through a sudden grieving process. How do I handle that? And you don't really have that much context. So like, how do you like help someone navigate through this complex journey of grieving in an immediate standpoint or immediate time period?
I have two versions of this, and maybe I can try to integrate this. Like, my gut instinct as a person who's like an empath and who's a healer by heart, like, I want to be like, let's fix this, let's make you happy, let's try to give you some candy, let's try to give you something that you enjoy. I don't know why my mind went to candy, y'all, but that's maybe what I wanted when I was a kid. Yeah, it does. Part of me wants to really soothe and fix the problem. And then the other part of me is scared to hold the problem and to acknowledge that there's something that's hurting there, that maybe it's a memory, maybe it's something that I can't understand. And that's kind of the conflict I have with trying to address it right away. Do I try to fix it, or do I stand in front of the person and get to bear witness to, a very powerful pain and suffering that's happening in front of them right now? Obviously, I want to make sure that they're safe. I want to make sure that you're good. I want to make sure that you're here. But I want to resist the urge to try to locate a problem within your own grief, because your grief is something that's telling you that something's missing here. Something happened. Listen to me. That part of you that felt abandoned, that felt unheard. Listen to me. I'll start with that, the listening.
Yeah, when I think about grief, I think about how complex grief is, right? And how grief comes in different shapes and forms, and we can grieve people and loved ones that pass, and relationships with people that are still alive, and expectations and dreams and goals that we had. And I think about how heavy, right, grief can be. And it doesn't matter what you're grieving, right, or what your grief looks like. Something that is really important is just holding space, right, honoring that grief, and also accepting, right, that you are entitled to grieve your own way. Well, we're not going to grieve the same, right? Dario maybe wants a piece of candy. Yo me voy a ir a llorar al baño. Right? But that's okay. That's okay, because we're all unique in our own way. But the most important thing for me is just holding space, whether it's sit next to me while I cry, or, make me laugh, while I try to understand what I'm feeling and what I'm going through.
Do you think for someone that maybe wants to help someone that's grieving, like that's a question that could be asked? It's like, how can I assist you? Like right now, is it a sign in the bathroom, or is it that piece of candy? Like, would you consider that like a good conversation piece to start off for someone that's witnessing someone else grieving?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's important to ask others, right? Like, is there anything that you need from me in this moment? But also, accepting that The answer may be, I don't know, right? And we can sit in that discomfort together, right? And that's still holding space.
I think it's also important for individuals to really sit in with that question of like, what do you need? Because I personally had a very difficult time, especially when I started up with my business. It's that people would see me scrambling before an event and they'd be like, what do you need? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, like I have it. And you want to always seem like you have it together, even though people are offering for help, and it's okay to accept that. And I think when we're tying it back to grief, like it's okay to shed some tears. It's okay to maybe even be angry. Like once again, going back to the complexity part. Now, I asked for how to deal with or how to navigate grief immediately. Is the answer the same when it's been years after? Like, or is there a different method for when time has already passed, quote unquote?
I think that's the thing about grief, right? That it doesn't have a timeline, right? I could be grieving something that happened 4 years ago, and I could also be grieving something that happened this morning, right? That I didn't expect, right? Or that I wasn't prepared for. And sometimes I could be going about my day laughing, singing, dancing my life away, which is what I do in my free time. And then I'll see something or I'll hear something, right? Or I'll smell something that reminds me of a special moment of something I may be grieving, whether it's a loved one, a relationship, a friendship that's no longer there, and it'll trigger that heaviness of the grief. And so it's important to also remember that there is no time frame for grief, right? That everybody grieves at their own pace, and that it's so complex, right? It's not a linear process. There's ups, downs, and like you figure it out as you go.
And then here's another example. What about, if any of you want to answer this, someone that maybe feels like resentful or a sense of like maybe I didn't do enough or I wish I had more time? How does one navigate that thought process?
A lot of the times when we look at grief, what we know is that it's really correlated to shame and guilt. And those two things are what we as therapists try to help our clients most with. Like those themes come up a lot, and especially in grief. So when we look at that, I think we have to see, I know what that means for somebody, what relationship they have with the responsibility they felt towards that person or towards whatever loss happened. And we also take some time to understand the heaviness that comes with that, because I think for everyone that can look different in terms of guilt. But yeah, I listen a lot to David Kessler, which is like a grief expert. He worked on the 5 stages of grief, kind of like adding on to it and finding meaning with grief. And a lot of the times that is what people deal with. And he mentions talking about how death is inevitable if we're thinking about grief related to death, and understanding that it's something that feels so out of our control, and so that's why we want to take ownership of it. And so it requires us to reframe thoughts about control in our life, and I think that's the start. But also it tells us too that it needs attention. It tells us that these are feelings that haven't been dealt with, and that they've turned into guilt and shame, and that's what keeps us from diving into it. So yeah, I'd say that's the start. David Kessler, double check that I'm pronouncing that right. Yeah, he's like a grief expert, so it's like, I could tell you the spelling, but yeah, I was.
I'm gonna just hold it.
Yeah, Kessler, Kessler.
Okay, so bringing back, did you have a question?
I did have a question. To your comment earlier, you were talking about grief is so complex, and I had this thought and I wanted to ask it. In your opinion or in your mind, what's the difference between grief and depression? Are they tied together at all? Are they very different? Because I feel like when you experience grief, you mentioned allowing yourself to like hold space or like to have that happen. And I feel like similarly with like maybe depression episodes, it's like, this is happening. Kind of like either like ride it through and just work towards it getting better. So I was just wondering, as the mental health experts, if you have any invites on shifts or they're related.
Yeah, thank you for your question. While they're both individual experiences, right? Grief and depression can interconnect, right? They can influence one another, right? My grief can lead or turn into a depression if I'm not giving my attention to it, right? And vice versa, right? I could be in a depressive episode or stage in my life that can prolong my grief experience. And so I think it's important in this to remember that there's a duality of emotions. We live in a society where we feel that it's either black or white, it's right or wrong, right? And the reality is that life is a lot more complex than that, right? There's so many things that are interconnected, and we can experience a duality of emotions, right? I can experience both grief and joy, right? I can experience both sadness and also excitement, right? And very similar with like the grief and the depression, they're emotions and experiences that can be interconnected, but that can also be very individual in the way that you process them. Grief, right? So complex, so heavy. When I think about, how we experience grief, a lot of it is tied to all these expectations that we have surrounding grief. And expectations can come from society, from family, right? Something that comes to mind for me is that in thinking about, when my family and I were grieving my abuelito, one of my cousins was having a cotillion within the 1 year mark. Right. And we always celebrate birthdays in my abuelito's house. Right. And my grandma was very strict on we are not having a party until it's been a year after the passing of your grandpa. And that was a really uncomfortable, moment for family members, because we all associate, my grandparents' home with beautiful memories. And for some reason, it felt like my abuelita's expectation of how she navigates her grief was getting in the way of us being able to celebrate the loved ones that we do have, right, alive. And so it's really important to acknowledge where those expectations are coming from, right? When I hear you sharing, I wasn't allowed to grieve, or I can't grieve, right? Where is that coming from? Is that... Yeah, right. Is that me holding and not acknowledging my emotions? Or is that maybe somebody else that is getting in the way of me being able to navigate my grief journey?
I want to add a little bit of nuance to that too. On on the coattails of acknowledging expectations, pressures. I also think pace, right? In terms of what is, again, if we're trying to detach from a timeline and trying to move all of that judgment away, it's hard to do so. It's hard to not do that when we feel like we need to come back to work, when we feel like we need to come back into a relationship, when we feel like we need to forget about it. People oftentimes ask us to do things that feel like we're erasing a part of ourselves, and that's a very unfair expectation, and we don't often get to say that that's unfair, because we have to move, we have to keep on going, we have to survive. There's no space for grief to happen, to breathe. So yeah, and what was said here is acknowledging that and getting to allow yourself to listen when your body is telling you to go slow. When you are saying that, hey, something's really happening here in my immediate experience that I can't ignore, and as much as I want to move forward, it keeps pulling me back and asking for this attention. So yeah, that's what I'll say to that, is moving at the pace, acknowledging that when grief happens, it's not something that you can just simply erase. Right? The trauma happened, the removal of our identity may have happened. We can't go back in time and undo it. Thanks for sharing that.
I also wanted to kind of piggyback off of, I guess, the subtopic that you were discussing, which was individuals or things that might roadblock the process of grieving and knowing what you need. A few months ago, at my job, I actually had my cousin pass away, and one of the first questions that I was asked from one of my supervisors was I know that you took off today and today and then yesterday off. Will you be okay to work on Monday? And first of all, no context of oh, sorry for no condolences, no nothing. And it was just okay, back to business. Are you good for Monday? And this was in a Zoom meeting with other individuals. And what I ended up saying was I think I'll be okay by then, because how does one answer that on the spot? So for me, and wanting to stand up for myself, I leaned in on my friends, and I even told my mom, and I mean, she's really protective of me, and she's well, just quit that job. And honestly, yes, Mom. But I had to go to HR, and I had to do a report on her, because how does one, as a supervisor, not know how to navigate something that's inevitable? Grief is going to happen regardless. And this concept of just corporate America just always just treating individuals as just oh, we're feeding my opinion, and it's we don't have these emotions tied to us, was beyond me. So I I reached out to HR and I had a meeting with them, and they were like, well, like there is a bereavement leave that you have. You've had X amount of days already. You have 2.5 days. Take those days. So whether that's family, friends, an outside source, like I really had to stand up for myself. And that's hard on top of grieving. I had to do that at least for myself, because I could have folded and I could have just been like, you know what? I have to go to work because my boss kind of insinuated that she expects me to be back on Monday. No, I had that meeting and I wrote it out in an email. I'm like, you're not going to see me until Wednesday morning or something. I forgot what day it was. And then that kind of opened up their eyes, but it also made me realize like the importance. Grieving is an interesting point for individuals. Grieving, it really makes you like reflect on your current state, whether that's who you have around you, the people that you associate with, especially with work. Like you talk to most of these people more than you talk to anyone else. And so when I saw that reflection of my supervisor, I was like, wait, like this isn't an environment that I want to be in. I have to stand up for myself. I could have easily folded. But I also should have given myself, if I decided to hold, like also give yourself grace, because you're also grieving and you're in emotions are something that you can't necessarily control and you're not in the best state of mind. So I just wanted to add that, like whether that's family, friends, resources, like try to see if there is feedback that you can get from individuals if you feel like you are getting these roadblocks of individuals or concepts or things that are getting in the way of grieving. Now, shifting a little bit into back to Dia de los Muertos, obviously something huge kind of came about in terms of society. Coco, we can't talk about Dia de los Muertos without Coco now. That was, first of all, I think that opened up the eyes to individuals that maybe never celebrated Dia de los Muertos or had no idea what it was. From each of your standpoints, is there anything that changed in terms of like after Coco came out that like changed your perception, or maybe like feedback that you got from other individuals about it? I personally just started like leaning in on the holiday more, because once again, like my mom always did some sort of Dia de los Muertos aspect to it that like around this time it wasn't really talked about, but even like in maybe it was me being more of an adult and just be more aware, but it's always like, oh, we have to get flowers for abuelitos or my brother and all of these places that I have to just send flowers out to. But that's the question for you all, like after post Coco, did anything change for y'all personally?
I want to just say this out before I forget it, but for me, after watching that, I didn't really like pay attention too much to my relationship to memories and remembering, because as a young person, like my memory is like relatively good. I remember a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad things, but I didn't really connect that memory keeps like things alive. For again, like memory, I used to associate with like, what can I memorize? What can like get me a good grade? What can get me from point A to point B? And I never had related memories in creating them, or using the process of remembrance as something that gets to be the thrust of a story that gets passed on as a thing that we get to use to keep the other people behind us alive, and that same thing with people ahead of us to keep us alive. I'll contain that right there, because that's as much as I got. That was just the aha moment that I had when I first watched it that I wanted to share with y'all.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't really see Dia de los Muertos celebrated around my house, so definitely did bring in like that perspective, and I was still able to relate to it, to the multi-generational home, and see how every family experiences grief differently. So I think, that made me think more about how our culture thinks about death and dying, and also taking us back to what we were talking about in the question before this. But again, David Kessler talks a lot about how we live in a very illiterate society for grief. Like we don't know how to deal with it, and that has a lot to do with industrialization, like what you were mentioning before. Like he mentioned like homes that were made before the 1940s had like these big doors, and that was for a purpose. It was so that a casket could come through, and the parlor is where we used to put the casket, and your family would come and see the loved one. And we changed that. We started moving sick ones to the hospitals with industrialization. We started moving the the dying to hospice care and no longer had that element to connectedness. So we don't see death a lot until we are hit with it with a loved one, or, you know, if you work in a particular field too. So it's really hard to interact with it. And so I think that that's why a lot of people are uncomfortable with it. And so then I do start to realize kind of like, yeah, like there's a part of my culture who is like from here and grew up here, and this is how we see it. And then there's also another part of me, you know, from my heritage where this isn't really how we do things. And maybe this is why there's a lot of disconnect in my community, in my family. And yeah, I mean, going back to the parlor room, now we call it the living room, because we don't want to call it the parlor room, because we want this to be referred as a living space and not associated with the parlor of death. And, you know, now they're called funeral parlors. That's where we go and lay our loved ones. So I think that it just shows how much industrialization has impacted this. And a lot of the times that puts more, you know, knowing that puts more meaning of why are we feeling so much friction here where we don't feel like we can grieve, or people around us aren't accepting it. And I think it's just to consider like, yeah, we're not in a world that's functioning to be able to understand how to read grief well.
Yeah, going along with that, I guess then, you know, what Coco does is that it honors, right, Dia de los Muertos and this part of our cultura, at least in Mexico. And for me, it's opened up so many doors to be able to talk about my grief, right? 2 years ago was the first time that I did an ofrenda in my house, right? And anytime that I had friends come over, they'd be like, oh, that's so cute. Who is that? And I'm like, well, this is my grandpa, and like he was like my father, you know, and I get to talk about it, you know. I cry, you know, with certain people. It's like, you know what, today I'm feeling really heavy, but like seeing my grandpa's picture here makes me feel like he's here with me. And so I think that what Coco did, it was just, you know, be able to create space, right? A little bit more space to begin processing and thinking and acknowledging our grief, or at least we can talk about it a little bit more open.
Tying it into like ofrendas and like creating that, for me, it's like a creative process of like kind of conceptualizing, like, how do I want to make this look? I don't know, like whose photo do I print out? Like who do I not forget? Like, I don't know, like it's a beautiful but sad.
Are they gonna make it through?
Like, yeah, did I print out a picture? You scared about them, because then they're gonna end up like, what's the one character?
Yeah.
What's his name? And it goes, and so this year I ended up making like a miniature version, because I just jumped into a new space, and I didn't really I'm doing like 2 like huge community ones, which is amazing, but I don't know, I feel like I kind of neglected my personal one. But I ended up semi-finishing 2 days ago, and it was, yeah, it's like, it's cool to see like the colorfulness and to see the creativity that I went about with creating this, but then also like it's sad to kind of see like you add more photos as like years go by. And that's always like one of my first thoughts, is that when someone passes away, is like good and bad, I get to add them to the ofrenda, like I still get to honor them, but then it's sad that like these are my memories, like moving forward with the individual, is like I have to consider them during this time period. Obviously, like they'll come up in other memories when I reflect on our shared memories, but I don't have a question there. But oh, actually, no. What's your process with ofrendas, altar making, if you've done it yourself, or if you may witness it? Like, how do you reflect on that sacred time?
I can start. Like I said, it was always very present with my family, con mi abuelita. It's so beautiful because sometimes, you know, they'll invite me and my sister, she's sitting over there, to make pan. And it's beautiful because as we're making the pan, or sometimes we just watch her make the pan, right? And record. But as she's making the pan and she's putting like, oh, este es para tu abuelito, or, you know, este es para fulano. She'll share stories, right? And it becomes like this beautiful thing where like now we're laughing, you know, and talking about like, oh, do you remember when your abuelito did this? Or like, do you remember X, Y, and Z? And sometimes, you know, there are moments where like it is heavy, right? Because like, yeah, she's sharing, you know, a memory that she has, but for me, it's like that grief, right, that kicks in, and I'm just like holding back tears. But it's so beautiful to be able to do it in community, right? And so when I think about the ofrenda, I think about that it's not something that, even though like at my house, yo pongo la mía solita, my tía's always like, oh, mándame una foto. O ¿qué le pusiste a tu abuelito, right? O, ¿cuál cerveza compraste? You know, but I like that like I don't feel alone in my grief. when I am putting up an ofrenda or when I'm visiting other people's ofrendas. And it's really beautiful, the time and the thought that goes into, creating such a beautiful piece of art.
Yeah, I haven't like made an ofrenda recently, but I always watch my mom engage in like this creative process where it's like, all right, gotta put the blanket down, we gotta put have visual height, make it all colorful, make sure that we have certain like textures involved, certain fruits. Yeah. So kind of just like the stage setting, right? I think the thing that sticks out to me too is, again, I keep going back to memory and I don't know why, but like we are very much like a storytelling kind of community. And so in like recognizing like as more people get added on, or as like specific people, because like there's so many people that have passed away in my family for a lot of things, and so we don't have that much space to like put everyone on there, so we have like almost like batches depending on like the theme of like how we want to remember, but there are some instances where I meet the ofrenda and I see pictures of people who I may not have had like the best relationship or the strongest relationship, and my mom kind of like fills in the story of like, okay, well this is who this person is in relation to you, this is where they're from, this is how they treated me. And I sometimes wonder too, like if I ever find a person in there who I recognize, like they hurt me, how can you tell me that this is like a healing memory? It's just like the contemplation, right? And she gets to add nuance, right? Like it wasn't only like that, my grandpa had not my grandpa, my grandma had thrown like chancla at me, or like she like chastised me or slapped my hand or anything. Like I used to remember her as like this evil person, like this person that I didn't want to be around. And she would tell me like, hey, like she had it really hard, right? Like she didn't always have her stuff together. She was very like traumatized in her life. And if you remember her that way, I want you to, also remember her with this story too, that it's not just like a single story that you get to have in your brain. There's also other pieces, other chapters that get to go in there. And I think that's the creative process, is like we have pieces of the story that we get to add. And that's what happens when I kind of like see my mom change the pictures or add different people. We get to remember in different ways, and that's the meaning making process. It's like the coping part.
Again, like I said, my family doesn't like really do that. So I guess I could say what I hope to do. I guess like reconnecting and reclaiming those parts of my culture would be, I do hope to share some of those similar experiences, and hopefully do it with like family members who do know, like more of my grandparents who have passed away and other family members too. But I also really like going to the art museum, the Pilsen Museum, and seeing the ofrendas there. I think they really bring a good perspective on community grief, and I hope to be focusing on that this season.
The celebration aspect and also like the mixed emotions and like balancing the two. So I'm glad that you actually kind of brought that up, because that's our last point. But before that, I wanted to reflect on like the fact that the representation is here on like, once again, like everyone's like different levels. So I just want to like commemorate you for like bringing up that piece, because you aren't the only one. I actually had a friend recently, she texted me, she's like, this is a silly question.
That's my question.
Voice message, and I was like, well, you could do this or you can do that. At the end of the day, if you kind of like even reflect on all of these like mini ofrendas, is that there isn't one that looks the same. If you look around the room, it really is what you want it to represent and what makes you happy, how you want to commemorate your loved ones. But going off of her comment, like how does one balance, and it's interesting because she brought in a perspective from like Mexico City and wherever else you grew up this concept. And also I hear that also from videos of like, we're just gonna go celebrate with the dead cemetery. and how do we navigate both the celebration aspect, but then there could be like the hints of like sadness and that could creep up at any moment. Like imagine being at a party and we're celebrating, grieving, honoring our loved ones, but then like maybe internally like, wait, I'm not in with a party mood. How does one kind of like navigate I guess that could be a piece of going back to audio with your piece of candy, and turning like a sad moment, and then I guess turn it around and be like, well, what's a happy moment?
Yeah. So the thing that I appreciate your perspective here is like we're adding nuance to this broad range of experience that we get to have as human beings. So in being able to balance like both grief and celebration, you have to acknowledge that the range is there. You have to acknowledge that in order to accept the suffering and to make space for change to happen, we have to make that spacious. We have to be intentional about making that space, because a person who passes isn't only just the loss, isn't only just like the anger, the frustration, and all of that. They are a human being that lived all of these things, that got to be happy, that got to be a person that makes mistakes, that got to be a person that fumbles, and the person that gets to laugh, And if we focus too much on just like the pin drop of grief, that memory doesn't get to have that richness. So yeah, like adding the nuance, creating the bridge between grief and celebration by acknowledging the range of emotions that are there and that get to be felt and that get to be experienced.
Yeah, what I would add to that is something that I shared previously, which is just honoring yourself and in your journey, right? I'm the type of person that, like, if I want to cry, I'm gonna cry. It's like soy muy llorona, lloro por todo. And there's times where, like, I think about really beautiful memories, right? With my abuelito in particular, and I'll message the family group chat, and my sister Prima's like, oh my God, I thought about grandpa today and I'm crying. And it could be, a happy memory as well. But I honor that feeling for myself and I don't keep it in, which I think is something that we all can struggle with at some point, right? Like feeling as though I can't acknowledge or that I don't have space for this emotion that may be uncomfortable and heavy. And so for me, it's been a lot about like validating, whether it's the joy, the sadness, right, the anger that sometimes hits me. It's just like honoring and naming that. Like I feel angry or I am happy right now, and creating space to hold that emotion for myself.
I had a reaction to that. I'm sorry, it's like flooding a little bit. I go back to the thing that I say with my clients, and this isn't me just like lecturing. This is me kind of just like trying to live by this piece of experience that I get to impart with clients, is that when we try to come into our own healing process and our own healing journey, the gut instinct, and this is what I said at the very beginning, the gut instinct is to kind of erase, is to like heal, is to fix, is to kind of solve the problem, right? We want to feel better, but in the healing process, that can be like a secondary gain, but we're really trying to become better at having the hard feelings. We're changing our relationship to the feeling. We often forget that we attach to certain emotions, that we fixate, and in that same capacity, in doing so, we have the same power to bend and mold and have a different relationship to certain feelings. Which is why it can sometimes feel very easy to sink into grief. It feels maybe like the safest emotion for us, right? It feels like the safest place to like sink into, right? Which is why we invite spaciousness. We get comfortable with other feelings that we get to have in that moment.
Well, we can quickly shift over to the Q&A portion. So if you have any questions, feel free to go on our Instagram and submit them while reading those off. We do have one. Do keep in mind that this is talking about an extra, well, we're already talking about a touchy subject, but on top of that, this one is related to suicide. So grief after parent suicide and survivor's guilt. Anything on like navigating that based off of the question?
Can we repeat the question? Is that like the full?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Grief after parent suicide and survivor's guilt.
What a heavy subject, Darren. I'm so sorry to hear that whoever shared, and thank you for acknowledging and bringing it up in this space. One of the things it's really important for us to remember is that we're not alone, right? And I know that can feel really heavy and uncomfortable, especially when we're talking about loss, but you don't have to navigate that alone, right? And sometimes, we go to our friends, right, or to family members, and they don't have the right answers, right? Or once again, like Dario said, we're jumping into like the suppressing, the ignoring, like let's get rid of this feeling. And I just want to invite you to take some time to think about what healing means to you, right? When you think about the guilt that you're experiencing, is it the relationship that you are trying to work through with whoever you lost, right? And not having to do it alone, right? Having a safe space to talk about it, somebody that won't judge you, right? Somebody that is going to help you recognize and understand, okay, where is this guilt coming from? And so if you are not, or if you have considered, right, I invite you to find a professional who can help you navigate the heaviness of what that experience is, because you don't have to navigate it alone.
If I could just share something from last year, and even in general, like a lot of my friends today have come from our events, like to have a sense of just holding space, like each and every one of us, whether you share or you have it, we're in a vulnerable state right now. And I really appreciate last year's conversation, because first of all, it was our first time ever doing a group discussion, but individuals connected in new ways where someone spoke up. And then I remember right after they're like, wait, I'm going through the same thing. And they connected afterwards. And then now I think they're still friends, but at least they had that moment to have a conversation about something. And it was a very heavy topic. And for me to now have individuals that I surround myself with, thanks to what we've curated here, on top of just professional health weeks, I also started off not being a mental health, or when we started off doing our mental health discussions, I wasn't in therapy myself, but like continuously being in spaces that advocated for it and like helped me realize like I do have a lot of things to say and I do need professional help. I think everyone, whatever capacity you want, like should have a mental health journey. And you all are doing a part of that by being here today. So once again, there is help out there. And everyone has, I hope, a piece of paper with Latinx Talk Therapy. We get messages of like, hey, like going to your events has helped me go to therapy myself. And a lot of the times it's with you all. So I just love that we're having more of these conversations, because overall it's discussions and talks that we didn't grow up with necessarily. I just kind of wanted to end on that note. And myself, do you all each want to end with anything, maybe a reflection piece on how today made you feel, or any last notes, comments?
A reflection, kind of also piggybacking off of the question posed earlier, and just in general, thinking about like, hey, we talked about grief, like what do we do? Like what do we do with this? I think about like self-compassion as like the antidote to grief, but underneath what it really is an antidote to is like the guilt and the shame around feeling grief. And self-compassion sounds like a cheesy thing, but it's really truly self-compassion if you have these three things, and it's, you know, connecting to the present moment of that experience, right? Like what's happening right in the here and now, not the there and then. What can I do to offer myself self-kindness? It can be that piece of candy. It can be connecting with other people who have these similar experiences and having that aha moment that I am not alone. I think the strongest piece of self-compassion is the common humanity aspect, is that we are human beings in the flesh, in the bones. We get to feel these things, and life happens. Life happens to us in unexpected ways. It can take us to a very, very painful place. And oftentimes we forget that other people are walking similar paths. So present moment, self-kindness, common humanity, these are the true pieces that kind of the face of grief in a way that might make it more digestible. Oh, you're good.
One of you, if you could answer, what are the different types of grief other than death?
We're constantly dealing with grief as therapists. I think that the beginning, when the question was first asked, like, how do we go about helping somebody through that? And it starts with listening. It starts with compassion, empathy. I think that's what we're constantly doing in our work. And we see people who come in with loss, like a transition in their life, whether that's moving places, in a new community, a loss of a relationship, a friendship, things that people feel very significant, and anything that kind of shakes up your world and makes you feel like your house has burned down to the ground and you lose this sense of connection with yourself. I would say when we identify it as grief. When David Kessler, again, on his podcast was saying that there's this community in Australia that a researcher found, and she came across this group, and they say that every time somebody in their community has passed away, everyone takes something out from their home and puts it out for the neighborhood to see, so that when the person who lost a loved one wakes up, they see that their whole world has changed. And I think, like, what a beautiful way to be reminded of that with your community and be able to feel seen, because that is what it feels like. It's something that really turns your world around. And yeah, I would say that those are the big ones we see: a loss of a relationship, a loss of stability, what your life looked like, anything that makes you just feel really disconnected.
To add like some names to that, right? Like traumatic grief that happens too fast, too hard, too much, like prolonged grief or chronic grief that happens once and then continues to happen and stretches out, like just like disenfranchised grief, right? Where somebody tells us that we feel grief and no, your grief doesn't matter. No, your grief doesn't make sense. Your grief is inappropriate, disproportionate. I also think cultural grief, I want to incorporate too, like maybe even queer grief, right? Grief that happens when people, transition socially, or when people are taking the step to invite people into their identity, into their experiences. I personally have that kind of grief that's ongoing in my life, where before I was 18, I was like coming into my sexuality and everything, and had got into a relationship and eventually like contracted HIV. And I was at this point where I was like, oh gosh, like, who am I? My parents didn't know that I was gay. I didn't want to reveal to them, hey, like, now you have a son who's gay. Now you have a son who also is gay and has HIV. So queer grief in that sense is like, all right, coming to terms with what culturally is there, but also like the loss of like who you were and who you wanted to show up for people that are around you in your community. So experiencing kind of like coming into contact with that loss and transitioning in that way and trying to build everything back up. Things are better, I promise y'all. but yeah, like I always wondered about that part of myself, that what it would be like if I didn't have this experience as a person who identifies as queer and who also has, these illness experiences, illness identities. Sorry, I didn't mean to overshare, but I wanted to give that out.
I'll just add that we live in a world that's constantly changing and time doesn't stop. And so grief is inevitable, right? Whether it's a loved one, whether it's a transition that we're going through, a career, an identity, a relationship, va a pasar, unfortunately, right? But just reminding you that you don't have to do it alone and that you get to honor, right, your experience and whatever that means for you in terms of how you want to process it and heal from it. Something that, the Los Muertos brings up for me and that like hold true to my heart is que el amor nunca muere. Right? Love never dies. And so whether that's the love that you have for a person that's here or not, like you get to honor that and know that he can take that away from you.